Stalker, the DARKSTAR File, by Archie Goodwin. Originally published in the first of a series of anthologies called Weird Heroes, which was republished in 2004. The concept is a 1970s revival of the Golden Age pulp adventures, and we will return to this series in future readings. The present story comes to us from an author better known as a comic book writer, editor, and visual artist, perhaps most notably for Batman and Star Wars. He wrote it at about the time he became editor-in-chief for Marvel Comics. He says of his Weird Heroes offering, in its Afterward, quote, "I've always pushed for a more realistic superhero, one who doesn't have to wear longjohns or save the world every issue or so." End quote. He also says, quote, "So I did Stalker, who wears a costume and fights against a mysterious group bent on ruling the world. Of course, it's a costume he could at least walk down the street in and not have everyone think he was on his way to a David Bowie concert. And he doesn't have a cape to trip over. And the mysterious group is bent on ruling the world from Oklahoma, which is quite a ways from the giant laboratories at the Earth's core, or on the dark side of the moon, where my villains are usually planted. It was a nice change, and it was fun." End quote. Read by Daryl T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Stalker, the DARKSTAR File. There were two of them, moving on hands and knees along the ditch beside the road. One wore a mummy mask, the other a Phantom of the Opera number. The Phantom was giggling, soft, muffled under rubber, excited. I could hear him before I saw them. To make it really easy, he had smoked a joint just before taking to the ditch. Even if there hadn't been a full moon, I could have found him by the smell. But the boy and girl in the parked Maverick weren't alert to sounds or smells, only to each other. They came out of the ditch, keeping low. Mummy took the driver's side, Phantom the passenger side where the girl was. It was hot. The windows were down. Mummy came up fast, jerking the door open with his left hand. Something glinted in his right. It might have been a knife, but the account in last Thursday's World of the rape and torture in Mohawk Park had said he used a straight-edge razor. By the time the kids in the Maverick began screaming, the razor was at the boy's throat and Phantom was tearing at the girl's clothes. I had used the sound of the car doors opening to cover my own movement out of the stand of horseweed on the far side of the ditch. The pair in the rubber fright masks had passed close enough for me to touch. I could have had them then, but it would have been like the guys who'd been trashing Ed's garage. Ed kept my 5-year-old international scout running. I'd nailed them in the alley out back, all set to wreck Ed's place for the third time. When the police found them in the morning, tied up the way I'd left them, they'd taken them in, questioned them for a while, but finally let them go. I spent another 2 weeks finding them again, but I made sure they were, obviously, into the act again before I came down on them, and I've been making sure ever since, like with Mummy and Phantom. By the time the razor was poised at the boy's throat, I was coming up behind Mummy. The fingers of my right hand kept opening and closing reflexively. It's been 4 years now. More. But there's a part of me that still wants to be gripping that M16, triggering it, despite the village. Despite the grenade, despite all the time I put in trying to bury that end of it. If I couldn't put the hunting behind me, maybe it's stupid to think I could the killing. But I try. I don't own a gun, and the only knife I carry is the Swiss Army model. Great for the woods, but getting past the saw, the scissors, and 7 other gadgets to the blade limits it as a weapon. Still, I have my hands. Sometimes that's enough. I clamped my right hand onto Mummy's wrist, not jarring the razor, but keeping him from moving it. As I went for the nerve center, by the carotid artery on each side of his neck with the fingers of my left hand, I dug the fingernails of my right into the nerves of Mummy's wrist, just the way the tough little sergeant major from Northumberland had shown us at the Royal Malaysian Tracking School. Mummy's fingers flew open. The razor dropped, but the rubber mask was slowing my effort on his neck. He was over his surprise and starting to struggle. I jabbed with the stiffened fingers of my right hand at his kidney. He gasped loudly, and I ripped off the mask, left thumb and forefinger sinking into the nerve centers on each side of the neck. Mummy sagged, something dying in his throat. Probably the beginning of a shout. Let's hear it for Northumberland. Phantom bolted up from the seat where he'd been clawing at the girl, eyes bright behind the layer of rubber, uncertain as to what had happened just across from him. I sank down with his falling partner. I couldn't be certain if he had seen me, but neither could he. While he took a beat to stare and try to decide, I was snaking under the car. He reasoned it the way I wanted him to. If something was going wrong, the car was a trap. Mummy jumped back from the girl onto the shoulder. That's when I grabbed his foot and twisted hard. He landed in the ditch, and before he could get up, I landed on top of him. There was little more to it after that, but nothing that any of my instructors at Bragg or Benning would have cheered about. But those bastards weren't much on cheering anyway. I stood up, and the couple in the car, beginning to come out of the numbness and shock, stared. What they saw couldn't have been too encouraging. Around Berkeley or the East Village, I might have been one more dude on the street. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, at going on 4 a.m, the long hair, the beard, the flak vest, and dark clothes blended into basic Hell's Angel. The dirt and mud I'd rubbed on my face and hands to cut any shine from my skin probably didn't help. Crazed hippie freak. Charlie Manson rides again. Time for the command voice. It's okay. You're safe. Drag the other one around to this side of the car. Move it, fast, before they wake up. NCO training. Get 'em moving. Keep 'em busy. Don't let 'em think. You can't beat it until you're in a spot where you need someone to think. Using Phantom as my model, I showed the boy and girl how to tie them using their shoelaces. Arms behind the back, bind the thumbs together, then the big toes. The kids weren't much on knots, but they got it done. Okay, fine. Number 1, I said. Now you're going for the cops. This road will lead you right onto Southwest Boulevard. Soon as you turn, you'll see the Pig in the Pen Cafe just beyond a Paxco station. A patrol car team will be inside having coffee. Go! They did. Not even a thank you, masked man. I checked over the area to make sure I hadn't left any traces, then I went over Mummy and Phantom's trail, making it obvious for the patrol car team so they wouldn't miss where the pair had hidden their car by the empty house. Phantom's dope was stashed under a seat. The pair might talk their way out of assault and attempted rape charges, but possession of a bag of the killer weed would hang their asses for sure. I double-timed over toward Skelly Drive where I'd hidden the scout on one of the sewage plant's private access roads near the bridge, and minutes later I was driving down Southwest Boulevard myself, heading back to Uncle Carl's trailer camp. As these things go, it had been a good night. The hunting's the thing, but until I find someone, I get edgier and edgier. Sleep comes harder and harder. Still, good night or not, when I looked down at my right hand on the steering wheel, the fingers were opening and closing, reflexively. Adam's Stalker and the hand that wouldn't forget. At least I'd be able to get a decent sleep. I was wrong. At 9:30, Bethany Cord, owner and chief operative of the Cord Detective Agency, knocked on the door of my trailer. Once in high school, Bethany and I had gone out together. For me, it was on a dare from my fellow jocks on the football squad. Her father was a detective sergeant on the Tulsa police force then. It intimidated quite a few prospective suitors. For Bethany, I suppose it was curiosity. Nothing much came of the evening. As Webster High School's hell-raising all-star halfback, I expected to get laid when I went out. Bethany didn't. Though we both went on to the University of Oklahoma, we were never more than nodding acquaintances. Sometimes even the nods were a little forced. One November day in my junior year, I looked around at the crowd cheering as a Colorado tackle I'd gone through was carried off field and decided I didn't want to play anymore. Not long afterward, I left OU for the Army and never saw Bethany Court again. Until she woke me up at 9:30. "You don't seem to answer the messages I've been leaving with your friend Leon and his wife," she said, as I peered through the screen door at her, still zipping the jeans I'd slipped into at her knock. "I decided I'd visit." 10 years sat very lightly on her. 10 more probably wouldn't make all that much difference. She had the kind of lean body and good bones that take age well. The pantsuit of faded denim she wore emphasized that leanness, just as her short-cropped hair emphasized the long, graceful curve of her neck. It was a neck that invited nuzzling. Her eyes, behind the blue-tinted lenses of her glasses, didn't. They were strictly business. "As I understand it, you wanted to talk to me about going to work for you. I don't need a job." I opened the door and gestured expansively at 6 trailers and 4 vacant plots. "All this is mine. The Stalker Trailer Court Empire. Legacy from my Uncle Carl. Plus my monthly disability pension. Legacy from my Uncle Sam. When the VA doesn't fuck up." Like any good bill collector, Jehovah's Witness disciple, or, I suppose, private investigator, Bethany accepted the open door as an invitation and stepped in past me. While going through the motions of setting down her shoulder bag, she gave the place a quick but thorough visual check. Not that there was a lot to see. The trailer was small. Bedroom, bath, and kitchen living area. It was built when they still thought people wanted to hook the things on the back of their cars and actually move around with them. For a widower like Uncle Carl, it had been just right. For me, after 6 years of mostly tents or wrapping up in a poncho, it was like the Waldorf. "Very neat," Bethany said. "Somehow I expected it to be sloppy." "It's the hair and beard. Everyone knows us wild-eyed radicals can't plot the overthrow of Christian democracy in anything less than total squalor." She smiled a little. It looked good, but didn't last long. Whatever had brought her wasn't really a smiling matter. "No, I was thinking that if I'd spent the time you have in something regimented as the Army, I'd react against it once I was free. I'd want to be messy." "Not much regimentation out in my part of the boondocks," I said. "Moving fast was the important thing. There's no way to pull a mess together fast." Bethany sat down at the built-in table and looked up at me. She sat quite still and was given to very few gestures or excess motions, but I could almost feel her fingers ticking off points as she spoke. "It's been 4 years since your discharge. You've got a small but adequate income, and since your neighbor Leon runs the trailer camp for you, nothing but leisure time. I wouldn't think moving fast would be important anymore. Old habits die hard?" My right hand was doing it again. Opening, closing, searching for that goddamn M16 stock. Bethany's eyes took it in briefly, moved up to the scar tissue on my neck and shoulders, then settled on my own eyes, studying for further reaction. When she didn't get it, she pulled a folded copy of this morning's World out of her bag and handed it to me. "I was fishing," she said, with another brief smile that made me wish I could be treated to a full-length version, "leading up to this." Bethany had circled an article. It wasn't exactly a piece of investigative reporting. Someone had taken the cops' version of what happened last night and rendered it into basic English. Like other times, their version didn't mention me. "They do know about you," Bethany said when I looked up noncommittally. "Not who you are yet, but they're hard at work on it. I've been talking with some of my father's old friends in the department from before he quit to start the agency. They want you in the worst way. You're making fools of them. Next to killing a cop, it's probably the worst thing you could do. So far, they've kept the lid on what you've been doing, but some reporter they don't have in their pocket is going to connect the string of incidents soon. They know that, and they mean to have you stopped before it happens. I laid the paper down on the table. Aren't you making a lot of assumptions about me? Yes, I am, Bethany said. I'm assuming that those are the same pants you wore last night because the little stains around the knees look like they could be from horseweed pulp. There was a large stand of it where the police found your latest catches. Chemical analysis could probably tie you to the scene much better. That side of the road is public land. It was sprayed by the city 2 days ago. They use a cheap and ineffective weed killer commercial farms wouldn't touch. Some traces of it are bound to be on those jeans. There didn't seem to be much to say except to ask her how she liked her eggs. But she'd already had breakfast, at 6, before driving to West Tulsa to look at horseweed. As I stood at the stove, Bethany took a packet of index cards held in a plastic sleeve out of a side pocket on her bag. She removed several covered with writing and referred to them from time to time as she went on talking. I remembered in high school she was the one whose notes everyone wanted to borrow. Of course, I have an advantage. I know all about you and your record. The police don't. Yet, Bethany said. Our agency hires a number of veterans as security guards. We've an inn at the VA who keeps us informed of new arrivals. That's how I first learned you'd come back to Tulsa. I remembered you from high school and college and went into your background pretty thoroughly. Basic and advanced infantry training at Fort Bliss, Texas, airborne jump school at Fort Bragg, Ranger and Special Forces training at Fort Benning and Dalton Air Force in Florida, something called Recondo School at Nha Trang, South Vietnam, and the Royal British Jungle Tracking School in Malaysia. Then you served on something else I'd never heard of, a special mission team, for over 4 years except for leaves. I thought 1 year was a tour of duty in Vietnam. Bethany looked up at me from the index card as I sat down across from her with a plate of scrambled eggs and a large glass of orange juice. I got gung-ho, I said. It didn't come out as funny as I meant it to. I guess I was moving ahead of Bethany and her index cards. To the village. They wouldn't have invested all that training for just one tour. No, I was what they call motivated. At first it was a carryover from the football thing. I liked being good, being best. And in Nam, I wasn't doing it for a bunch of cheering assholes. But finally, I think I came to like it because it was just me and them. Basic, simple, like things ought to be, but almost never are. We'd have assignments, specific missions, sure, but in the end it'd boil down to the same thing, moving at night, hunting, being hunted, never thinking about who they were, who I was, at least not until the grenade business. Someone from your own unit threw it into your tent. What's the word they have? Fragging. That's where you got those scars. Uh-huh. The beard hides a lot. So does the hair. I pulled it back on the left side and let Bethany see the pitted red nub that used to be an ear. It's a cheap trick. I usually save it for rednecks in bars after they've been coming on for a while about the length of my hair. But sometimes, like with Bethany, I seem to test people with it. I've never quite decided just what the test proves or the exact response I'm looking for. Maybe when I know, I'll give it up. Bethany wasn't having any. She didn't quite yawn, but there was a touch of impatience in the way she looked. Why was I bothering with this? Obviously, it was already down on the note card. And when your hair grew back in, it was gray? I nodded. But getting fragged wasn't what started my questioning Nam. Something happened before that, brought on the fragging. Your sources seem pretty good, but I doubt if this made it into your notes. I knew there had to be something. All that training, all that experience. And they'd let you just slip back into civilian life. Not even an offer from the CIA. You'd go to a hell of a lot of trouble picking a security guard. I got up and began washing off my plate and glass. Bethany slipped the index cards back in their sleeve and tucked it into her shoulder bag. I don't need a security guard, Adam. There are things to be done that no one else in my agency has the particular skills to do. You have them. Instead of staying on a collision course with the Tulsa police, I want you to use those skills for me. Bethany stood up and walked nearer. I was wrong earlier about her eyes being strictly business. It was something colder, harder than that. About a month before you came back to Tulsa, Bethany said, a file was stolen from us by a former employee, Floyd Riggs. He's now chief of security at the Paxco refinery. I need you to steal the file back. Doesn't sound like a big swerve from that collision course. What is this file? What's it deal with? An organization that should be familiar to you, the DARKSTAR League. I believe they had my father killed for keeping the file. And I believed it was possible. After all, the DARKSTAR League had me cover up the murder of 25 people, men, women, and children. Well, Bethany said, will you do it? My impulse was to say no. Instead, I said I'd think about it. Bethany left it at that and went back to doing whatever private detectives do at 10:30 on a Thursday morning. I went back to scrubbing a plate that was already clean and thinking about it. The first thing I thought about was lying inside a cocoon of bandages at Zama Army Hospital in Japan, listening to the soft gurgle of various tubes running in and out of me, watching the light show on the back of my eyelids. Then I heard the voice. The doctors, the nurses, I always heard coming long before they spoke. I'd spent too long in the bush, in the dark, to miss anything moving near my bed. But I missed the voice. It just began right beside me, a slow, measured whisper, distorted through the gauze and tape, impossible to identify. The voice wanted me to do what everyone at the base camp before the fragging had wanted me to do, what Hugh Dunsford and the DARKSTAR League wanted me to do, what Lieutenant Kenneth H. Chalmers wanted me to do, forget about the village. In return, the voice would forget about tearing out the various tubes it now was pinching for effect. Lost beneath the bandages, I found the one thing I never had in the years in Nam, in the months of training. My breaking point. I'd never been helpless in my life, but there on that hospital bed, I was. Maybe that's what broke me. My jaw was wired so I couldn't even scream, but I could cry, and I could nod my head a little, enough to agree to anything the voice was asking. The voice was very reasonable. Fragging me had been messy. It would be much neater for everyone concerned if I didn't die, if I just lived and got discharged and kept my mouth shut about the village. So I cried and nodded my head and paid back the DARKSTAR League everything I owned them with interest. The DARKSTAR League was an organization of wealthy men who had gotten their start in Oklahoma's oil fields. The name came from one of the state's biggest strikes, made in 1923 near Cromwell by Billy Sam Arnett, a wildcatter from the California fields. "Oil's the star I follow," Billy Sam was said to proclaim on occasion, "my dark star." His strike became known as the DARKSTAR Strike. It also became the foundation for the Arnett Petroleum Company, which was second only to Standard in the area until overtaken by Phillips and Paxco just before World War II. Like Billy Sam, who served 3 terms as U.S. Senator, the men who formed the DARKSTAR League wanted to help the state and the industry which had made them rich. Most of the League's activities were promotional, but some were philanthropic. Whenever and wherever possible, they liked to help fellow Oklahomans who showed potential. At least that's what Hugh Dunsford told me the first time we met. He arrived at Uncle Carl and Aunt Marion's house in the Carbondale section of West Tulsa on a January day in 1961. The whole neighborhood took notice. Carbondale was not the kind of place where you saw many new cars, at least not Lincoln Continentals, particularly not ones driven by a chauffeur. I could see heads in all the windows as I let him out in our door. My senior class advisor at Webster had said to expect the visit, that it might be very important to my future, which was fine because my future at the time didn't seem wildly promising. My mother and I had come to live with Uncle Carl and Aunt Marion when Dad was killed in a barroom fight while waiting to be shipped overseas to Korea. Like his tries at professional football and professional wrestling, his career as an Army lifer was cut short by the bottle. Only this time it was the glass, not the contents. I was 10 at the time, just right to never quite get over it. The drinking, the moving from place to place that wore my mother down hadn't touched me yet. The man died in time to leave my illusion intact, and nothing I learned later seemed to crack it. At least not on the surface. But you could probably make a pretty good case for most of the things I've done with my life being an attempt to complete what Dad kept starting and failing at. Uncle Carl and Aunt Marion took Mom and me in. They'd closed in the back porch on the 3-room house in Carbondale. Mom settled there, and I got the fold-away couch in the living room. Aunt Marion was the nucleus of this small universe, perhaps its prisoner. The rest of us were comets, trailing through it at various times, but never really staying. Uncle Carl was more or less a mechanic, working at an irregular procession of gas stations, repair shops, and garages. Mom, who'd been a waitress when Dad met her, became one again, working nights, odd shifts, growing tireder, thinner, harder. I moved between school, part-time jobs, and practice for whatever sport was in season. On holidays, we all gathered around the kitchen table for dinner and the awkward conversation of strangers. We'd probably still be doing it, except in my last year of high school, Mom found she was dying of cancer, and the rest of us found she couldn't afford to. By Christmas, I'd decided to forget a football scholarship to OU and drop out to find a full-time job. Instead, I received the visit from Hugh Dunsford. Standing in our living room, giving his velvet-collared overcoat a quick, neat fold as he handed it to Aunt Marion, Dunsford looked as out of place as his Continental parked outside. He was a tall man in his 40s with well-toned, lightly tanned skin that suggested sun lamps and rub-downs. He wore his salt-and-pepper hair combed straight back, making a virtue of his widow's peak by emphasizing it. He looked in good condition and wore clothes well. Maybe a little too well for Oklahoma, where being just folks was the state fetish. The membership of the DARKSTAR League probably regarded him as something of a dude, but in a society of good old boys, Dunsford was impressive. And when his pale blues settled into a stare, and his radio announcer's voice took on an edge, intimidating. Of course, on that day in Carbondale, he restricted himself to being impressive. Mostly it was overkill. With what he had to offer, he could have been a delivery boy riding up on a Cushman eagle and still impressed us. "You mustn't feel you're accepting charity," Dunsford said. "The DARKSTAR League sees any help we extend to you, financial or otherwise, as more of an investment. All the people we talk to think you've got a big talent, Adam. A talent sure to carry you beyond college football into professional athletics. Jim Thorpe, Mickey Mantle. Those are proud names in this state. And the DARKSTAR League wouldn't mind a bit giving Oklahoma someone else of equal stature. That's the kind of potential we see in you. And with that kind of potential, we're certain the future will see you able to repay us many times over." It wasn't unlike the kind of speech the football team got at Kiwanis and Lions Club lunches. Only the delivery was better, and the benefits went well beyond roast chicken with gravy. It took Nam and the village before I saw how little was hype, particularly the repaying part. But I got a hint the second time Hugh Dunsford visited. He showed up at my dorm the day after I let OU know they were short a starting halfback. The tone this time was intimidation. Dunsford even wore a darker suit for the occasion. He was disappointed. Some members of the league were angry. My behavior seemed irresponsible, dangerously irresponsible, particularly in view of all that had been done for me. The medical expenses, the funeral costs when my mother died in my freshman year, the convenient summer jobs which left me with tidy amounts of cash to see me through the school year, the new cars donated each fall for my use, the fixed speeding tickets, the squelching of publicity on a brawl in one of Oklahoma City's better-regarded whorehouses. The last two didn't seem to fit the league's promotional or philanthropic activities. I said as much. Dunsford turned from his disinterested study of paperbacks crammed into a shelf above my desk. Members of the DARKSTAR League are men with connections, Adam. They're also men used to protecting their investments. They are not used to having investments fail. Whether or not you play football is your decision, but I guarantee you won't be on this campus by the end of the week if you fail to show up for practice tomorrow. Dunsford, you ever knee anyone in the balls or gouge somebody in the eye for no better reason than a few thousand dipshits have paid money to see you run a ball from one end of a hunk of grass to another? I play tennis for the exercise, Adam. I've always tried to avoid contact sports. Dunsford reached for his overcoat, carefully draped on one of my chairs. I could afford to. You can't. You've a talent for violence and a profitable channel for it. What will you do if you give it up? Spend your life picking fights in bars? Whatever I do, it's going to be because I put my ass on the line, and for something better than a stadium full of weekend blood sniffers. Dunsford was already at the door. He sighed with the resignation of someone who's heard just what he expected to hear, and looked back. Try to remember what I said about the League's help not being charity. You're no longer as useful as you might have been, Adam, but don't count on being written off. Before the week was out, my scholarship was withdrawn and an application for a student loan turned down. I decided to join the Army before I was drafted, and the next time I saw Dunsford was in Nam, just as I was beginning to push hard about the village. It was a little south of the DMZ, too small to even have a name, or at least a name we bothered learning. It wasn't much more than 4 hooches and a well. I came there because of the well. For something over a month, our team had been up north. Officially, it had been to scout NVA troop movements. Unofficially, it was to pay back infiltration of our line units. Grunts had been waking up to find their foxhole partners with throat cut and penis and testicles stuffed in their mouths. Morale wasn't worth shit, so someone decided the NVA should wake up sweating too. It should have been a clear-cut mission. No hassle with outside factors beyond our control, as when we had to bring out a downed airman or some CIA spook. Only the lieutenant or team leader got tired and did the worst thing you can do in the bush. He fell into a pattern, moved the same way once too often. He and 2 others bought the farm for it. 3 of us got away. My wounds were superficial, the others weren't. Still, we finally crossed the DMZ, but it took a week of moving without water, surviving by chewing bamboo shoots. When I saw signs of a village ahead, I hid the others and went to check it out. The place was clean, peaceful, beginning to stir. I could smell rice cooking, hear a hungry baby starting to cry. Daylight was almost full as I moved back to get my men. The sun had already burned off most of the mists when I heard the first shots. Plenty more followed. M60s and M16s. Grunts or Marvin the ARVN, not the NVA. At least a platoon, moving in on the village from the south. They already had their Ronsons out, setting the hooches aflame when I got there. I think most of the villagers were already dead. 25 people taken by surprise don't last long under full platoon firepower. But the shooting hadn't slacked off. The grunts were charging wildly around like they had the whole 17th NVA division in their sights. Near the well, a first lieutenant was waving a .45 and screaming, Don't let any of them get away! Don't let any of them get away! He didn't hear me come up beside him. He was big, more than half a head above my 6 feet. He had handsome features, but appeared almost baby-like because they seemed too small for his open, ruddy face. More so because they were squinched up in anger. Tears ran across his red cheeks. The Campbell's kid learns war is hell. I wasn't sure what I was going to do when I approached him, but as soon as I was close, I struck his wrist with the barrel of my M16, then knocked him down with the butt as the .45 fell from his hand. So far, his platoon hadn't even noticed me. "Tell them to stop," I said, "or I'll blow your fucking head away." He began yelling, and a couple of non-coms took it up. Meantime, I noticed something he seemed to have dropped earlier, a map. As the firing died out, I looked at it. Christ! The wrong village! You led him into the wrong damn village! I know! The Campbell's kid said, as though being forced to tell his teacher that he hadn't done his homework. But if they're all dead, nobody has to find out. There weren't many of them, and... He shut up. After a month in the bush, I was mostly hair, dirt, and shredded tiger suit. I don't know exactly what he saw looking up at my face, but he shut up. The rest of his platoon was coming close, and they were silent too. But it was a sullen kind of quiet. Dangerous. I kept my M16 leveled at the lieutenant's head. "Take your men out of here. Take 'em out fast." As he stood up, I ripped off his dog tags. He rubbed his neck where the chain had broken and looked at me blank-faced, no longer crying. Then he and his platoon got the hell out. I counted the bodies. 25. There might have been more in the burning hooches, or everyone could have run outside when the shooting started, hoping to get away. But at least 25. I stared at the dog tags I'd taken. His name was Chalmers, Kenneth H. He had blood type A. I filled my canteens with water from the well and went back to my own men. I didn't want to bring them to the village anymore. Nobody at base camp really wanted to hear about it. Some officers fingered the dog tags uneasily and talked vaguely about how these things happened, how it was that kind of a war. Some got indignant, demanding to know how I could be on a special missions team and still get upset over someone else killing gooks. I hadn't really thought it through, but that brought it home. Up north, it was me and them. It wasn't women and it wasn't kids. But boil it down, and I was doing pretty much the same as Kenneth H. Chalmers, just killing gooks. We didn't give a shit for Nam. Anyone leaving it talked about going back in the world. At best, it was a place where you could prove you were a good soldier. At worst, you proved you were First Lieutenant Chalmers. But either way, you were killing gooks and nobody cared. I hadn't seen it before because I hadn't bothered to look. Until the village when the Campbell's kid showed me the war. And myself. So I made up my mind about two things. I was through killing, and I was pressing charges. Nobody at base camp could talk me out of the last thing. Nobody bothered about the first. That's how it stood when Hugh Dunsford stepped off a chopper up from Saigon for his third chat with me. He dressed just as well for Nam as for the States. No safari jacket like the CIA spooks favored, just regular fatigues. But they were perfectly tailored and weathered to just the right shade, and his boots came from a sporting goods store, not clothing maintenance. The story seemed to be that he'd been meeting with Thew's government officials and members of our embassy, something involving offshore oil. How he parlayed that into a trip in-country wasn't clear, but his reason for doing it was. The time had come for me to pay back the DARKSTAR League. Only I welched. "Surely it's clear, Adam, that the League has interests and influence considerably beyond what we show the public," he said when we were alone in one of the command bunkers. "You're placing yourself in the way of both. Kenneth Chalmers has a bright political career once his army service is complete. It's a career we have reason to promote." "I hope so. He's going to have a hell of a job campaigning from Leavenworth. Any charges you bring, Chalmers will be cleared of. Understand that. We have the power and the influence to guarantee it. That's not at issue, but we prefer not to have it in his background at all. A political opponent could capitalize on the accusation alone, so the accusation won't be made, and you'll have squared your account with us, Adam." I told him to go back to Saigon. He did. 2 days later, someone rolled a grenade into my tent. It almost got clear. It tapped something as it rolled. I woke up and instinctively twisted away into canvas and tent pegs. A dust-off got me to 12th Medical Evac. They saved my jaw. The left ear was long gone. After that, it was Japan, and skin grafts, and metal to replace missing bone, and transfusions, and a whispering voice to take up where the grenade left off. I decided to get some more sleep before calling Bethany Cord and turning down her offer. The copy of The World she'd brought was still on the table, so I took it in with me to leaf through before nodding off. Only the society page woke me up. It had the article Bethany might have been better off showing me, if she'd known. Essentially, it was a wedding announcement, but since it involved the prominent Tolsons and a minor national celebrity, elephantiasis had set in and swollen it to feature article size. The Tolsons were Jared Paxton of Paxco Industries and his family. Their daughter was marrying a freshman congressman whose television appearances, while serving with the House Judiciary Committee, had made the charisma calibrators take notice. Being the son of an old New England family whose discreet patronage in charity, the arts, and politics had eased them into the position of American royalty, as well as being a much-decorated veteran of the recent Vietnam conflict, hadn't hindered him in the force to be reckoned with in 80 or 84 sweepstakes either. There was no mention of the boost he'd gotten from me and the DARKSTAR League. In the 3 accompanying photos, Kenneth Hadley Chalmers looked pretty much like the same overgrown Campbell's kid, only his crew cut with white sidewalls had flowered into one of those carefully sculpted jobs sported by the fiery young second bananas on all the TV doctor, lawyer, and detective shows. Also, he no longer seemed to have anything to cry about. So I called the Cord Detective Agency and told Bethany maybe I was the one to get back the file that seemed to have landed Floyd Riggs his job at Jared Paxton's refinery. The Dodge Dart was pulled over under some trees along the side road just beyond the trailer camp. It was robin's egg blue with a black hardtop and had rental plates. Nothing happened when I swung out of the camp drive, but as I went into my turn from the side road onto Southwest Boulevard, it started up and carefully kept one car behind me as I drove toward town and Bethany's office. Traffic was light. It has been ever since they rerouted US 66 onto Skelly Drive, which made it rough for a lot of small businesses looking to the boulevard for drive-in trade. Like Uncle Carl's trailer court. But it's nice when you're being tailed. I checked my watch, 11:43. I goosed the Scout a little without trying to be too obvious about it. 11:44. I could see the Santa Fe crossing ahead and no cars in front of me. I slowed down as the red lights and the bell started. Trees and a billboard for Jack's Beer on my side of the road made it impossible to see where the train was. I glanced at the sweep of the red second hand. The left-hand lane was clear. The Dart was holding its one-car interval, matching my crawl. I slammed the Scout into second, hit the gas, and went leaping across the tracks. I didn't bother glancing to my right because I knew what the train would look like. Very big and too fucking close. I hooked the wheel to the right and nosed into the drive of the Paxco station just beyond the tracks. Nothing seemed to have stayed on the train. I cut left, pumped the brakes, and stopped hard by the inside pumps. The attendant stood in the doorway staring at me, shoving his tongue in and out of his cheek. "Damn, you sure as hell must have needed gas." "No," I said, getting out of the station wagon. "The John. But you can fill it up." I looked at my watch, then over at the train moving through the crossing. 11:46. Right on time. Hell no, the attendant said. That son of a bitch is always 15 minutes behind. Same difference, I said, and headed into the office, past the latrine, to the lift and grease pit area, then out the overhead doors and on the side of the station nearest the tracks. I trotted quick over dirt and gravel into the weeds by the track bed, about 25 yards from the crossing. Once the caboose passed, I meant to run across low and fast. I'd reached the dart before it was moving. Meantime, I kept down in the weeds, waiting. That's how I saw the blurred motion of a figure taking cover by one of the trees on the other side of the track. Through the flicker of the train wheels, I saw his head come out briefly again, probably making certain he'd grabbed the best possible cover. He had. He was black, with a moderate afro and a heavy mustache. Today he wore a jacket and pants of what seemed to be green leather. Last time I'd seen him, he was wearing a black suit and a chauffeur's cap and was leaning against Hugh Dunsford's latest Continental, while his boss peered through the screen door of my trailer and told me how unhappy I'd made the DARKSTAR League by coming back to Tulsa. As far as we're concerned, Adam, Japan was the finish, Dunsford said, squinting, because I wasn't standing close enough to the screen for any reactions to be read well, or for any sudden moves from him or his chauffeur out in the drive to be effective. If you've returned with notions of revenge or some such, that would be foolish. Pure and simple. We can crush you. In the Orient, you had a glimpse of what we can do if necessary. And it was just that. A glimpse, a hint. The gentlemen who founded the League were quite foresighted. They saw that as the need, the demand for oil increased, so would the conflicts, the controversies over its use and control. From the beginning, they worked to stay ahead of any problems, to remain in control of any situation. We're still doing that, Adam. The scope has grown from this state, this country, to the world. We're subtle. We stay behind scenes, but we're there. Create any kind of trouble and you'll learn that, quickly, permanently, and in the way you undoubtedly understand best, violently. Having given himself an exit speech, Dunsford turned and marched back to his chauffeur and his Continental before I had time to top it or dilute the effect by prolonging the exchange. Stagey. But he had my memories of the Zama hospital and a whispering voice to make certain it still came off. But they were bad memories to stir up, to play on, because that makes you want to lay 'em to rest, which means confronting them, and whatever caused them. Like it or not, Bethany Cord was offering that chance. The caboose cluttered past, and my first confrontation with the DARKSTAR League was underway. I flattened into the red clay soil of the weed patch, waiting to see what reaction Dunsford's chauffeur would have when I didn't come charging across the tracks the way we both originally had it figured. There was a moment of silence. Then there was a laugh. It was deep, but burst out fast and short, almost like a sneeze. It didn't make me think of confrontations, but of a case of Johnny Walker Black from the Da Nang Officers Club and the 3-day bender that followed. You're still bad, Indian. It was something I rarely got called in Oklahoma. With the hair and the beard, too many more obvious things seemed to spring to the local mind. In the Army, once they got curious about the story behind my last name, it was inevitable. Great-granddaddy was a Yankton Sioux named Stalker. Great-grandma was the wife of an Indian agent. Family history is vague on just who raised Grandpa, but at some point, when he was making his way through the world, the name got shortened to Stalker. With that out, I was Indian, and usually deferred to on wood lore and survival techniques. Never mind that Stalker's contribution was watered down to a 16th, or that anything I knew about the wood lore or survival came from the same sources as everyone else. Uncle Sugar and experience. At least they didn't call me Chief. Hey, Stalker, I ain't carrying. Step out and talk to an old buddy. I let him do the stepping out first. He really wasn't carrying, and he really was an old buddy. Jesse, I said, rising out of the weeds. You've changed. We both have, stud. Harrier. I just didn't get as carried away. He smiled as we met on the tracks. Jesse Long had been sergeant of the first team I was assigned to in Nam. The fact that he was from Oklahoma City gave us a bit in common, but by the time I made sergeant and was switched to another team, we were friends. We'd been celebrating my promotion the time we stole the scotch. Would you believe, Indian, I didn't even know it was you that day Dunsford came to your trailer camp? I nodded. If you hadn't laughed, I'd still be in the weeds wondering who was behind that tree. Not like you to slip up, get spotted. No slip up, my man. Think I'm gonna go snaking in the dirt just 'cause you might be peeking under the train? That'd ruin all these fine clothes. Jesse snorted out his laugh and spun around on red and gray alligator boots to show off the whole outfit. He was about 35 now, heavier than in Nam, but none of it looked like fat. Even with high wooden heels, he was a bit shorter than me, but his shoulders and upper torso were broader, beefier. Working for Hugh Dunsford hadn't hurt him a bit. Shit, Jesse went on. I ain't on maneuvers, just want to rap. This is the place for it, I said. No more trains for half an hour. Won't take that long. Left my wheels illegally parked to play these games. Besides, you don't want to be late meeting with the lady, right? Jesse was smiling as he said it. Then he just stopped, like a curtain had come down. Thing is, man, when you go to that meeting, I gotta get on the horn to Dunsford. He's sitting in an air-conditioned office over in Oklahoma City in a boxy-looking building, all bronze metal and smoked glass. The DARKSTAR dudes call home. When he hears what you're doing, he's gonna say, Jesse, move on it. And I'm gonna move. Not on it. You. That's my job. You got a shit job. I'd quit. Same hard-nosed Indian. Ain't learned to roll with nothing. Someone says push, you gotta pull. How many people, me included, told you to back off reporting what went down in that village? Every fucking buddy, right? Army had one my lie. That's their quota, man. They weren't talking on another one. No way. You were begging to get your head handed to you. And now look, doing it again. Wasn't being blown up enough? What you think the DARKSTAR people gonna have me do? Slap your wrists? Thought you were a lifer, Jesse. How'd you wind up being Hugh Dunsford's hired badass? Jesse let out a long breath, slowly. When he spoke again, some of the hardness was gone from his voice. He spoke quickly but deliberately, as though saying something he'd been waiting for a long time. While you were out on that last mission of yours, I had me a last mission too. Didn't know it when I went out, but coming back, I decided, stepping on a fucking mine. Years in the goddamn boonies, and I step on a fucking mine like the greenest grunt ever set down in country. It was one of those pressure release dudes. I kept my foot on it while the rest of my team eased some M60 ammo cans on the detonator plate till the weight was right for me to step off without the mother blowing. End of war, end of career, baby. I wanted out, fastest way possible, long as it wasn't through Zama Hospital like you. His brown eyes studied mine for a moment, making sure I understood. I did, maybe a little too well. I had plenty of R&R due me, Stalker. I took it all. That's why I never got around to looking you up after the fragging. When I came back, I hustled the cushiest spot I could. No more special mission shit. Just played Mr. Cool till my hitch was up and I could go back in the world. Only this recession crap was going down in Oklahoma City, going down hard. No jobs, especially if you were black. So I fell into doing a little boosting, breaking and entering, sometimes steal a car. Kind of putting my army training to work. Nothing fancy, but it put me next to brothers who were into heavier stuff. Word comes round about a job, equal opportunity employment. Someone big wants muscle. They don't care what color it is, long as it's the best. Someone big turns out to be Dunsford, looking even more impressive than that day he stepped off the dust-off to see you in base camp. Everybody figured him for State Department at least. Kind of pleased him when I told him that. Anyway, he knows my record and likes what's in it. That was it. Jesse managed to smile. First in my neighborhood to break into the oil business. But for payroll purposes, they carry you as a chauffeur. Uh-huh. And it's pretty good cover for when I have to move in white sections. But it's just that, man. Cover. I got but one job with the DARKSTAR people. Got its drawbacks, but it's better than anything else I ever had going. I can dig it. Very few mines in Tulsa or Oklahoma City. But it's still a shit job, Jesse. I don't have a trailer camp to fall back on, Indian. Even if I did, this ain't the kind of thing you quit, and I ain't been at it long enough to retire. Jesse started moving up the tracks toward the street. I walked along. Gonna go see the lady now, Stalker? You don't think you talked me out of it? Anyone ever talk you out of anything? Once. I've never been too pleased about it. Twice wouldn't said any better. Just thought I ought to make the try. Jesse stopped. We were at the street. He stuck out his hand. I fumbled the grip. It wasn't any of the old ones from Nam. What's that? I said. I'm at least 3 years behind on the latest handshakes. Jesse shook his head. Red power. You always were a piss-poor Indian. He started up the little path worn in the ground beside the curb. Sidewalks had never really caught on much beyond the downtown area of Tulsa. But then, neither had walking. Oil, the internal combustion engine, and inertia were too much competition. See you, Jesse, I called. He glanced back. Nope, not if I'm good as I'm supposed to be. His dart was just up the street by a no parking day or night sign. I watched as he got in, made a fast U-turn, and disappeared down Southwest Boulevard the way we came, probably looking for a phone, or maybe he was driving back to Oklahoma City to tell Hugh Dunsford in person. Downtown Tulsa is disappearing, moving out to the suburbs and giant shopping centers with its citizens. A new living arts center, library, and post office don't seem to have helped. A lot of tearing down and rebuilding is being done, but it's a lot like cosmetics on a corpse. Lately, Main Street's been remodeled to look like a shopping center mall. That hasn't helped either. West of Main is Boulder, named after the city in Colorado. All the north-south streets west of Main are named for western cities. Everything on the other side for eastern cities. They're also in alphabetical order. It's a pretty simple system, but it's shot with exceptions. Beyond 3 or 4 alphabets, it gets dumped entirely. Much of the wrecking and erecting downtown is happening on Boulder, but the block between 4th and 5th Streets has escaped so far. The Cord Detective Agency was in one of the escapees, a tan brick job trimmed in white stone and red tile to suggest Spain or maybe Mexico if either place went in for 12-story haciendas. Apparently it had been some kind of residential hotel and failed. Now, judging by the empty slots on the lobby directory, it was failing as an office building, living on borrowed time until the city planners came up with a modern, worthwhile, and duller replacement. Cord's offices took up the rear half of the 11th floor. The reception room was dominated by twin portraits of the Tulsa skyline, one view by day and one by night, and by a 50-ish lady with light purple hair who, after a disapproving look and a confirming phone call, led me to Bethany's office. We passed through a large open room. Most of it was given over to a bench-lined area where uniformed security guards gathered. The rest, separated by a railing, contained desks for field operatives. The walls needed paint, and almost everything made of wood seemed to have cigarette burns. Bethany's father may have moved from the police force to private investigation, but he had carried the look and feel of the squad room with him. Bethany had obviously inherited his office. It was brighter and cleaner, but had the same feel as the big room. She was trying to counter this with plants and a small aquarium. It didn't completely work, but it helped. "You've been playing in the weeds again, Stalker," Bethany said once we were alone. "Near a railroad track, the Santa Fe. I'd say someone followed you, and you doubled back on them, using a passing train for cover." I checked myself out. This time it wasn't the pants. They'd picked up a little clay and sand, but Tulsa had miles of both. But there were 3 green stick-tights on my flak vest where I couldn't have felt them, and a bit of tar and gravel on one boot, all of which could give you weeds and possibly railroad tracks. Bethany smiled. Another of the quick ones, unfortunately. "There's a smudge on your forehead. Diesel soot." It might have been a truck, but combined with the other 2 things, I opted for a passing train, particularly since you had to cross the Santa Fe tracks on your way here. And why would I get out of my Scout to go crawling around in broad daylight unless I was doubling back on a tail? Elementary, my dear Stalker. They must love you at parties. I usually save it to impress new clients. Makes them feel they're getting a real detective, just like in the paperbacks. Otherwise, they're a little uneasy about putting their trust in a woman. Or maybe I'm too sensitive. After school, I tried police work. It wasn't a happy experience. My beat kept turning out to be at the switchboard or typewriter, while men I could outthink and outperform got the kind of assignments I'd joined the force to have. So you got Dad to take you into the family business. First, I had to prove I was a real professional. He would tolerate almost anything else in a person as long as they were professional, but it wasn't easy convincing him. While I was growing up, he thought my interest in his work was cute. He wasn't prepared for me to make it a career. Most people react the same way when they hear what I do, so I overcompensate with a little warmed-over Sherlock Holmes. "It works," I said, and gave her the details of my encounter with Jesse. And because she listened very well and asked just the right questions at just the right times, the details kept expanding until I was into Nam, Kenneth Hadley Chalmers, and the village, and finally Zama Hospital and the voice. "I'm staking a lot in your missing file, Bethany. I'm hoping it can hurt the DARKSTAR League enough to make up for my keeping quiet about 25 dead Vietnamese, maybe even enough to stop Kenny Chalmers' blossoming political career. He's come too damn far in 4 years, even for a Campbell's kid." Bethany had been making minute notes on index cards as I talked. She slipped a rubber band around the pack and stuck them in a drawer, then opened a folder already out on the desk. Along with other material, it contained another pack of notes. I don't think she really needed them, but she glanced down from time to time anyway, just to be certain. "It's a habit I picked up from my father. He was a great believer in keeping records, taking notes. 'Always get it down in writing, Beth, honey,' he used to say. 'You never know what's worth looking back on.' When he quit the force after 20 years, he had quite a set of private files to look back on. And in 9 years running the agency, he added to them considerably. All of Dad's information could keep a large number of important Tulsans squirming. I don't think he used the files for blackmail, Adam. Not in the technical sense, but he didn't keep their existence a secret. Consequently, the agency never hurt for business. It was a success right from the start. Jobs that might have gone to larger national firms found their way to us instead. But Daddy wasn't greedy. He didn't milk the situation, and he delivered. Any case he received was well handled. No one got cheated or less than their money's worth. By and large, it seemed to be a happy enough arrangement, until the DARKSTAR League got fed up with it and had your father killed. Bethany got up and walked to the window. She motioned for me to join her. Directly behind the building was a parking lot and some 2 or 3-story buildings, allowing an unobstructed view of what older residents call the new City Hall, though it's been there about 15 years and up close shows more cracks than any good 15-year-old building should. "If you crane your head a bit, you can see where it happened," Bethany said. "There, at 5th and Cheyenne, shortly after midnight. Daddy had been working late. Whenever he did, he'd stop at the Cheyenne Lounge before coming home. It's close enough to police headquarters that he could always find 1 or 2 old friends having beers after coming off duty. A car hit him as he was crossing the street. The medical examiner estimated that it must have been doing at least 50. The impact broke one of its headlights. Some hangers-on in the lounge heard the whole thing. They come out in time to see a black Continental disappearing around the corner onto 4th Street. I looked at Bethany. Did it have Oklahoma City plates? She walked back to the desk and the note cards. Referring to those 3x5 pieces of paper seemed to give her words distance, enabled Bethany to keep it cool and professional. No one saw the plates. It's been 7 weeks and the police haven't found anything. The case is in the open file, which means they've given up the investigation. Some of Daddy's pals claim that the word came from higher up to give the case standard treatment. Fulfill all procedures, then file and forget. That kind of influence would come easy to the DARKSTAR League, but it might to others your father had dirt on as well. You can't be certain it was the League. She smiled, but this one wasn't real. Just a cold thing the eyes never got behind. It didn't miss it a bit when it was gone. I can't prove it was the League. There's a difference, Adam. Bethany took something else from the folder on her desk. It looked like a police mugshot, but up close proved to be a Cord Detective Agency ID card. The man, full face and profile in Polaroid color, looked to be in his 50s. The card said he was 46. It was a pleasant face, probably handsome in its day, but that day had been about 20 years ago. Even then, the chin would have been weak. Now it was losing further ground to a set of folds. His temples and modest sideburns were nicely splashed with gray. The rest of his hair was reddish-brown, dipping thickly and gracefully across his forehead, maybe too thickly and gracefully. Floyd Riggs, I read from the ID. He wears a rug, and the gray comes from a bottle, Floyd's vein. He's also gay. The detective squad forced him to resign 7 years ago. As long as it wasn't obvious, they looked the other way. But Floyd made the mistake of becoming too open, moving in with a boyfriend. It wasn't an image the force could live with. My father knew him and was happy to hire him. As I said, all he cared about was that his people were professionals. Floyd was that. Possibly the best investigator we ever had. Daddy was considering making him a partner. Your father must have badly misjudged Floyd. I think he badly misjudged how far the DARKSTAR League would go to get the file from him. I believe he felt that as long as he wasn't pressuring them, they'd accept the situation just like anyone else he ever had a file on. In the meantime, they must have been making offers to Riggs until he got one too good to turn down. The day after Daddy was killed, Floyd told me he was quitting. Even after I assured him I'd honor my father's intention of making him a partner, I thought he was genuinely upset by my father's death, perhaps even regarded it as some kind of writing on the wall. At any rate, he obviously seriously wanted out. I didn't even attempt to hold him to the usual 2 weeks, but then Floyd didn't appear at the funeral. It made me suspicious. When I arrived home, I found I had a right to be. The house had been broken into and the DARKSTAR file taken. I started to ask a question, but Bethany anticipated it. There'd been attempts to lift the files before. That's why Daddy had them moved from office to home. Whoever broke in circumvented the main alarm system as well as the backup. and was able to find where the files were hidden without disturbing the rest of the house. 2 people had the knowledge to do that, Adam, and the skill. You and Floyd Riggs, I said. You were at the funeral. What was Riggs' alibi? A job interview. Floyd met with Jared Paxton to discuss becoming chief of security at the Paxco refinery. The police were very impressed. Evidently, Jared Paxton was too. Floyd started the job 1 week later. I stood up, stretched, and paced the room a little. Normally, I'd have been up for less than an hour, probably about to treat myself to a chicken fried steak at the Pig in the Pen. If I didn't get anything going with one of the waitresses, I'd be starting to think about the night's hunting. Basic, simple, just like Nam, before the village. What's in the damn file, Bethany? What made them want it so much? Most of the material I never saw. My father seemed to prefer it that way. But I worked on one case that went into file. One of the local truckers' unions hired us to track down an official who'd run off with some funds from the union treasury. We found our man in Dallas, sharing an apartment with 2 topless dancers and a lot of Jack Daniels. Apparently, he'd filled a suitcase with everything he could grab from the union's safe. That included some checks. One was from the DARKSTAR League. The amount was impressive, but since it was in with the other checks, I didn't think too much about it. My father did, enough to slip a Xerox copy into the file before the material was turned back to the union. Shortly afterward, the truckers went on strike against the local oil companies, refusing to haul gas to any stations. Big places like Paxco weathered it fine, but a number of independent stations and chains went out of business, including one whose president had been trying to organize the independents against crowding out by the major firms. It doesn't sound like anything that'll knock the pins out from under the league. They surely had a cover reason for the check. Donation to the Truckers' Relief Fund for hardship hemorrhoid cases. Something like that. Bethany nodded. And there was a cover reason when that runaway union official died just before the strike ended. It was called hit and run. I never realized it happened until I decided to check back on that type of accident when Daddy was killed. Perhaps there's no connection. Totally different cars were involved. But the thing is, Adam, these are possibilities from one item. The DARKSTAR file has many of them. Investigating is usually a matter of accumulation. You don't often find the dagger with the bloody fingerprints on the handle. It's more like pulling threads until little by little the whole ball begins to unravel. And your father had a big package of loose ends just begging to be tugged. Okay, I can see the league getting itchier and itchier over the file that stayed with your father. Still, it seems like they lived with it for years without having to do anything. You sure he didn't turn up that dagger with the bloody prints after all? What was the last thing he was working on? It was in the set of note cards Bethany had out, which meant it was a possibility she'd already considered. But Cord's last case, apparently a pretty standard one. The wife of a dentist in Southern Hills who thought her husband was playing around. He was. Our field men were very happy with the photos they got, Bethany said. There was a lot of anguish when Daddy turned all the prints and negatives over to the client. The dentist wasn't important enough to have a private file. Some of his patients may have been, but this wasn't the kind of material Daddy would use against anyone. At least I'd like to think it wasn't. Shortly before he was killed, he seemed to be having regrets about having kept the files at all. Too much temptation for one person, Beth, he said one night when he was putting some material away. Should have burned them when I still knew I could make it without them. Now I can never be sure. I decided that if I inherited them, I would do what my father couldn't. Burn the lot. Can you be sure Riggs or the League haven't already given you a start toward that? Bethany looked at me levelly from behind the light blue lenses of her glasses. Yes, because Riggs is still alive. If the DARKSTAR file had been destroyed after it was stolen, Floyd wouldn't have a thing to keep him from winding up just like my father or that runaway union official. Instead, he's dividing his time between a comfortable office right at the heart of the Paxco refinery security system and a cabin cruiser that he and two muscle-heavy friends keep shifting around Keystone Lake. Floyd sounds like a hard man to visit. That's where you come in, Stalker. There was a lot I had to be briefed on first. Bethany had most of it on her index cards, but that and the planning took the rest of the afternoon. As I stood up to leave, Bethany began to reorder her notes, integrating new material with the old. I'll go over it later alone. There's always something you miss the first time. Here, might as well add this to the collection, I said, and handed her the society page I'd torn out of the World this morning. Guess I don't need to psych myself up by carrying around a picture of the enemy. From the way I'd folded the page, a photo of Paxton, his wife, Kenneth Chalmers, and his bride-to-be stared up at us. Jared Paxton was a dark man, square and solid-looking. He seemed to have better things to do than smile for the camera. Kenneth Hadley Chalmers more than made up for it. His fiancée had inherited her mother's thin but heavy-breasted body, and she shared her father's reluctance to smile. Or perhaps marrying a Campbell's kid was just plain serious business. Or just plain business. She has a sensuous mouth, Bethany said. Chalmers may be getting far better than he deserves. I studied Ken Chalmers' practiced smile for a few seconds longer, then started for the door. Not if I reach Floyd Riggs. Gravel flashed beneath me and sprayed up like a claymore exploding. The flak vest took most of it, but several pieces hit my face. The fuel truck swung onto the Paxton Refinery Road without slowing down. Late at night, coming off Southwest Boulevard, there shouldn't have been any danger. Except, with all three gas tanks empty, the rear end bounced like hell as it came off the concrete, almost shaking me from where I hung, braced between the truck's two spare tire racks. I slipped down another inch, pushing harder with my legs and back. I checked the slippage, fighting back a cough from dust raised by the truck as it headed for the rear gate of the refinery. Climbing in rock clefts during my training around Fort Benning, I'd found I could usually hold such a position for half an hour or more. Of course, no one had been blasting me with dust or gravel. The 10-minute trip from the all-night Paxco station where I'd mounted the truck felt more like 10 hours. And once we were through the gate, the job would just be started. The driver chatted briefly with a security guard at the gate. It gave me a chance to check my watch. Blood trickled from a gravel cut above one eye. The scent might put the Dobermans onto me faster when I hit the inner grounds. 2:03. I looked at the burlap bag on top of the spare tire at my feet. No sign of movement, and it seemed to be riding fine. Bethany had gotten the bag about 9. I don't know what kind of story she used or what it cost to swing it. The sedative was estimated to last 5 or 6 hours. Bad. To be safe, I should have been on top of the storage tank already, but the driver had taken his own sweet time checking the truck's tanks and putting away hoses before leaving the Paxco station. Now he sent the truck lurching forward toward the storage tanks in the yard beyond, ready to pick up a fresh load of fuel. With a good percentage of all-night stations, Paxco made round-the-clock deliveries. That was in my favor. It also meant the refueling yard was Christmas tree bright any hour. That wasn't. I got down when the truck finally halted, but didn't move until they were actually pumping gas, and the driver and the yardman were laughing, talking up by the cab. Then I moved out on the side by the tank. 2:20. The burlap bag was tied by its drawstring to the left-hand side of my web belt. I thought I felt a movement inside. I elected to consider it as nerves and edged toward the ladder that ran up the nearest storage tank. The main grounds were separated from the refueling yard by a 12-foot cyclone fence which encircled the whole refinery. Topping it were 3 strands of high-voltage wire. Armed guards were always on duty by all gates. That was what you could see. There were no traces of the alarms, of course, until you set them off. According to Bethany, most of this grew out of the 1974 energy crisis, when the hijacking of several gas trucks seemed to justify increased security all around. Once in effect, it was never relaxed. But, like anything, there were weak spots. Of sorts. From plans Bethany had furnished, I picked out the 4 storage tanks, each 70 feet tall. Regular, ethyl, no lead, diesel. Paxco fed their gas stations from these, and they bordered the main grounds, replacing the fence where they did. Reaching the ladder of the regular tank, I slipped in between it and the smooth metal surface. With the flak vest and the web belt solidly hung with equipment as well as the burlap bag, it was tight. But climbing this way, I'd create no silhouette to attract attention. I started up, moving awkwardly, the bag overbalancing me. Ordinarily, I limit equipment to exactly what I think I'll need. For average forays, like my run-in with the pair in the fright masks, that's next to nothing. Around buildings, rooftops, a coil of nylon climbing cord comes in handy. But reaching rigs involved too many factors neither Bethany nor I could be sure of, so I carried my whole bag of tricks, such as it was, plus a few extras we doped out, like the burlap bag. Oh, damn! I froze. One of the yardmen had come scrambling up onto the truck. I was almost level with him. He seemed to be staring straight at me. "Joe Don, you got fucking no lead running in here. Order calls for 2 regular, 1 ethyl." He bent down to the tank compartment being filled. Joe Don joined him. I began climbing, wanting to go fast, knowing I couldn't. "Hell," Joe Don said. "Make the rest regular. Half the shitbirds driving around don't know what they should be using anyways." The driver climbed up too. All 3 talked at once. No one seemed to have stopped the flow of no lead, or looked up. Yet. Not far above me was darkness. The top of the storage tank rose higher than the lights had beamed on it. I swung out to the proper side of the ladder and began scaling it quickly. Down on the ground on the far side of the truck, a huge shadow figure was suddenly doing the same, begging someone to notice. Then I rose above the light, and the shadow giant was gone. 2:30. There was a definite twitch from the bag. I stood still, took several deep breaths, felt better. The cut above my eyes seemed to have dried. I decided to skip any first aid. Undoing the nylon cord looped onto the right side of my belt, I crept to the center of the tank where there was a small cluster of valves and pipes. I tied the cord to one of them and moved to the tank's far side, dropping the rest of my line over into 70 feet of darkness. It was short by about 35. Gripping the cord, bracing my feet against the side of the tank, I went into descent. There were more twitches from inside the bag. At the end of the cord, I dangled full length by one hand, gathering the bag up against me with the other. Then I dropped. Jump school all over again. It's a long way to fall, especially in darkness. You keep expecting to hit, then don't. But when the impact came, my actions were reflexive. The training all came back. I doubled over, hugging the bag close, shielded from the shock, and rolled. The ground was soggy, yielding. Oily mud sprayed around me, but nothing broke. Ahead were more storage tanks, much bigger around, if not as high as the one I dropped from. Floodlights at their bases played up on them, but the areas between, such as where I was standing, were dark. Beyond the tanks, the refinery proper rose in the air, its erector-set structure covered with lights. They seemed to flesh out the towering, twisting metal, giving it the appearance of a city of massed skyscrapers, lit against the night. Then I heard the dogs. They weren't barking. It was a strained, eager snarling. from 3 directions, which confirmed Bethany's information. 3 teams patrolled the grounds, 2 Dobermans, 1 handler each, all coming toward me amid the storage tanks. Using my Swiss Army knife, I cut the bag's drawstrings free of my web belt. Grabbing the bottom of the bag, I jerked it away from its contents and ran low and fast for the protection of one of many pipelines that snaked over the grounds. For a moment I was afraid the sedative was still working. Then as the dog teams heaved loudly into view, I saw movements, wriggling streaks of white. The handlers' flashlights picked them out also, when it was too late. They'd kept their animals leashed, but given them their head. They came converging fast on 2 skunks, neither happy over being rudely awakened. "Oh, Christ!" someone yelled. A lot more followed, but I was already moving along the pipeline in a fast crawl. There wasn't much chance of any of the Dobermans would be picking up my scent. The skunks moved as I had hoped. They got away as planned. Past the storage tank area was a small tin-roofed building, exactly as Bethany's map had shown. A sign stenciled on its door read, "Quality Control Station 4." I picked the lock. On hooks inside near the door were hard hats and what looked like lab coats. I took 1 each and left the burlap bag. Until I reached Floyd Riggs, I didn't want anyone finding out that the skunks hadn't come in by themselves. For the same reason, I'd kept my climbing cord short, so it wouldn't be left dangling down in easy view. My watch said 2:51. From one of the pouches on my belt, I took out a length of slow fuse and cut it for what I estimated would be the time I'd need. When everything was set, I lifted a clipboard that hung near a complex of dials and pipes, lit the fuse, and stepped out. After relocking the door, I jammed the lock so anyone showing up with a key still couldn't get in. With my hair tucked up in the hard hat, wearing the coat and carrying the clipboard, I was able to walk freely to the Paxco refinery security offices. They were in a whitewashed concrete block building. The windows at the rear had bars. That was where I'd find Floyd Riggs. But the only way in was through the front door. 2 brown uniformed security guards rushed out past me as I entered. There was a counter across the front of the room. 2 more guards were behind it. One was at a radio mic, talking to the boys in the field. The other, who should have been at the counter, was drinking a Pepsi and listening. Squawking that didn't quite reach me as words occasionally came out of the radio receiver to interrupt the men at the mic. "Just sent out our last 2 men, Harvey. Andy Riggs is having a hissy. Wants every inch of that fence checked. He says those polecats weren't born in here. Gotta be a break somewhere, he says. Well, I wouldn't do that, Harvey. Don't think Auntie wants to see you or them dogs. He's locked up in his office to sulk. You know he comes in nights 'cause it's cool and quiet and nobody can bug him. You and them skunks have upset his whole evening. Say again, Harvey? Well, you know Auntie's got broader tastes than most folks. He may have already tried that, Harvey." The radio man turned to wink at the dude with the Pepsi and saw me. A nod of his head brought his partner around. According to the name tag on his freshly pressed shirt pocket, he was Severs. Beards made him scowl a little, but apparently he had seen them before inside the Paxco gates. I kept the clipboard up high to cover the blank spot where my ID should have been. "Like to see the security chief." "Chief's a little busy now, partner. You better talk to me." "Well, I think he might want to hear this personally. See, I was making the quality check down at Station 4 tonight. You know, near where the watchdogs were doing all the fussing earlier. Found something pretty odd. Could be the chief will want to call Paxton himself about it." Severs frowned, but went to a door at the rear and knocked. After a moment, someone opened it. Then he disappeared inside. The radio man was still talking with Harvey. "Diesel fuel don't cut it, huh? Old boy I knew up in Ulaga used to swear by tomato juice. Say again, Harvey?" The door opened. Severs stepped out and Floyd Riggs, looking very much like the pictures I saw at Bethany's office, curtly waved for me to join him. Once I was in, he locked the door after us. Well, otherwise, those boys outside poke their heads in every 5 minutes over some fool thing or another. Riggs leaned back against the edge of his desk. He didn't ask me to sit down. Now, this isn't a fool thing, is it? I've already had my patients tried this evening. You know Quality Control Station 4? Riggs looked annoyed. I know the whole refinery. Part of my job. You can see Station 4 from the back window. His wall clock ticked off 3:09. Would you take a look out there now? He did it, acting like a man who's humored a child and is beginning to regret it. As he looked, I laid the clipboard on his desk and began taking out what I needed. By the wall clock, it was 3:10. Riggs was just starting to turn back and ask me what the hell was going on when he saw the explosion. It didn't make much noise, but it looked bad, taking out the little building's one window, lighting up the whole interior. Riggs spun around, mouth open to yell something, when his eyes fixed on the pink, rubbery wad I was kneading with the fingers of my left hand. I don't know how much you know about plastic explosives, Mr. Riggs. They gave me a course in Special Forces. Funny stuff. You can twist it, break it, slap it around like silly putty. I slammed the wad up against the side of Riggs' desk. He winced. I pushed a small metal disc into the pink mass as it clung to the desk. But nothing will happen unless you explode it with a detonator cap. They've got some interesting ways of doing that. I held up the little black box in my right palm. Someone began knocking on the door, probably Seavers. Newest way is with an electronic charge, radio transmitted. Of course, you need a special kind of cap as well as the transmitter. But if you got both, you can explode something from far away as, say, here to that quality control station, or from close as, say, here to that desk. On the other side of the door, Seavers began shouting as well as knocking. Shout back, Riggs. Tell him you're on the phone with Paxton. Tell him you want every available man down to find out what's happened at Station 4. Floyd did it, without taking his eyes off the black box in my hand. Who are you? Riggs said, once Seavers was busy again. I'm the man you're going to give the DARKSTAR file to, and whose time you're not going to waste by saying you don't know what I'm talking about. Riggs seemed to relax, perhaps comforted that I had some purpose beyond pointless terrorism. He even smiled and moved for the first time since turning from the window. You're not from the League. They surely know better. But Bethany? She didn't have any luck using agency people, but I should have known she wouldn't just let it lay. His voice was smooth, with more of a deep South accent than Oklahoma drawl. Combined with the artfully gray temples, Floyd almost came off courtly. Even if he'd been straight, I doubt the detective squad would ever have loved him. He came closer to his desk, smiling more. Am I right? She's hired you. I stepped around and opened the desk drawer he was approaching. It contained a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson Terrier and a checkbook. I wasn't sure which he meant to use, but I removed the Terrier. Let's say Bethany and I are in it together, Riggs. I have a personal stake in seeing the DARKSTAR League do some big hurting. And before you get too comfortable with the idea that I've been bluffing, consider this. To stay alive, you must have arrangements so that if something suspicious happens to you, the file goes to someone who can use it against the League. I'd much rather be able to use it myself, Floyd, but if it comes to the crunch, that'll do. The DARKSTAR League needs you alive. Not me. Not Bethany either. Not after you set her father up to be zapped in exchange for a cabin cruiser and a cushy spot here in Paxton's Playland. Think about it. Riggs patted his hairpiece and did just that. He was just a little too old and a little too overweight to make jumping me worth considering. And without knowing more about me, my nature, everything else had to keep coming back to my losing patience, tying him up or knocking him out, then strolling outside and pushing the button on my little black box. Floyd licked his lips and gave the hairpiece one last pat. "You won't be able to get the file yourself. I'll have to take you to it." "And that's where?" "The cruiser. In case I die, there's arrangements, just like you figured. But something my life depends on, I don't care to keep far from my hands." He moved to a coat tree in the corner, removed the police-style hat that went with the rest of his uniform. "I suppose you'll want me to tell the boys outside that we gotta go see Mr. Paxton now." "Fine. With one addition, Floyd." I ripped the pink wad off his desk and dropped it into the unturned hat in his hands. We reached the company parking lot just outside the main gate without any problem. Riggs had a current model LeSabre, complete with radiophone and white naga hide interior. "You plan to switch to your own vehicle someplace," he said as he opened the door. "Or shall I drive us all the way?" My Scout was parked way over in the northeast section of town, near a wooden area off Dawson Road. It was the kind of spot where kids parked and more than once got raped or robbed, which also made it the kind of spot I picked for my nightly forays. Except I had left the woods on foot to be picked up by a friend of Bethany's and dropped off at the all-night Paxco station as prearranged. If the DARKSTAR people were still having me watched, it was being wasted on a parked international, and anyone spying on Bethany would find her spending a quiet evening at home. "You can drive all the way, Floyd," I said, stopping him as he started to slide under the wheel, "after I easy my mind about something." I found a Browning .25 automatic clipped under the dash, where a hand appearing to use an emergency brake could pull the gun instead. It slipped nicely into the pocket of my jeans, the terrier I had thrust in my web belt. After I tossed the hard hat and lab coat into the rear seat, we both got in. Riggs put his hat on the armrest between us. He had carried it carefully all the way to the car without putting it on. Before starting the engine, he stared down at the soft, almost fleshy mass with the shiny metallic disc at its center. "You know, up close under the dome light, that special detonator cap looks a lot like one of those little batteries some camera flash attachments take." "Uh-huh. And plastique is more of a blue-gray color. The clays I tried were pretty close, but most of the effect is in the way you manipulate the stuff and slap it around. Silly Putty did that best." Color came up in Riggs' face, and anger. "The damn explosion in Station 4 was real!" "But mostly flash powder and a preset fuse." I pushed the button on the black box. Nothing happened. "Pocket alarm. Needs batteries." "I'd say you went to a great deal of trouble just to play me for a fool." "No, Riggs. Just enough. Enough confusion to keep all your security force occupied, but nothing so messy that Tulsa's tax squad would come piling in every gate, and enough threat to make you break down fast, but still be in shape to get us out of your office and off the grounds nicely and quietly." Through the anger, Riggs still managed a tight, faint smile. "Now that's fine. Only you're some distance shy of getting the file, and completely through the hoax. That would make me take you to it." "I don't need a hoax now, Floyd. I've got all these guns, and Sievers and a radio man aren't right outside to make me prefer not to use one." I drew the terrier. It wasn't an M16, but it felt very comfortable in my right hand. Maybe too comfortable. "Let's go to the lake." In the night stillness, the launch's outboard motor sounded like a 707 as it came across the water from where Riggs' cabin cruiser bobbed at anchor. But this finger of the lake was an isolated one, not likely to attract campers in the middle of the week. Whatever happened here would only bother the fish. Riggs had phoned ahead as we drove. It seemed to be a nightly procedure. "One of the problems with living the way I do, but it makes it hard for us to be taken off guard. At least it did until now." Contact was good. I could hear both sides of the conversation. Someone named David took the call. Floyd told him he was bringing a guest and gave an estimated time of arrival. David expressed regret that Jason was spending the night in town and would miss a party. Riggs glanced over at me. "No party, David. I don't believe the gentleman swings that way." The call seemed to leave Riggs feeling talkative. "Does it bother you that I'm gay?" I knew a few homosexuals in the Army. Some were all right dudes, some weren't. None of them ever used it as an excuse for getting a buddy chopped. "You think that's what I was leading up to?" His words came faster, and he began patting at his hairpiece, as he had at the refinery. "I don't need to make excuses, not for Cord's death. He was one of the few people in Tulsa who knew I was a good detective and was willing to let me go on being one. I liked him, and I warned him the DARKSTAR file was trouble, many times. He thought he could handle it and the people it involved him with. Well, he was wrong. It is not my fault. He was killed." "No, you just ripped off the only thing between him and staying alive." "I didn't do anything until after he was dead. There was no helping him then, so I helped myself. Jared Paxton had felt both of us out about the file. Well, it seemed like the moment to do business. Bethany's a bright girl, but she left the police force too damn soon. She's still got an idealistic streak as well as some illusions that her father kept his hands a little bit cleaner than your garden variety blackmailer. Types like me. Once she saw the DARKSTAR file, I knew what she'd do, declare war, and that was going to be fatal, for her and anyone who partners with her." Riggs nodded his head as if agreeing with himself and gave the hairpiece another pat. The dash lights underlit his face, weighting each wrinkle and fold with shadow, making them look like lines etched in stone. "The gay world's no place to grow old. Maybe the straight isn't either, at least not if you have my tastes. Not if you find most of your pleasures in the young and their pleasures. Time comes when you no longer attract or interest those who attract and interest you. Instead, you pay. Taking the DARKSTAR file made it possible for me to pay very well. Cord couldn't handle it, but you decided you could. Cord left people wondering where they stood with him. I made it plain what I wanted from the start. The boat, the car, an easy job that enables me to afford friends like David and Jason. I made it all very plain, and it worked." "Uh-huh," I said, "for almost 2 whole months." Riggs looked over at me and at his revolver in my hand. Then his eyes went back to the road, and he didn't talk anymore. Not until we stood at the edge of the lake, and he pointed out the obvious. "Here's David with the launch." David was a big boy, hair bleached white, surfer style, wearing a tank-top shirt which showed off his weightlifter's body. He looked at me and the gun expressionlessly, then glanced to Riggs. When Floyd told him just to take us out of the boat, he seemed satisfied. The cruiser was a 36-foot Kingscraft, big enough to sleep 6. Lights were on, and I could see easily into the empty galley as we approached. David brought the launch alongside a ladder at the stern and started to tie up. "He returns to shore, Riggs," I said. "We'll signal with the flashlight when I'm ready to go back." Neither of them gave me an argument. When the launch was well away, I turned to Riggs. "All right, where's the file?" Floyd opened the door leading into the cabin. "In the galley. The refrigerator." He went ahead of me, down 3 steps into what the promo pamphlet Bethany had provided called the master stateroom. From there, you could look past the closed door that had on the left into the large galley, complete with dinette and bar. Beyond, I could see the forward cabin with its twin bunks forming a V into the bow. Other than a transistor radio and 2 used cocktail glasses left sitting out on the bar counter, everything was practically showroom clean. "David's a very neat boy," Riggs said, suddenly talkative again as I prodded him forward into the galley. "Keeps everything. Well, ship shape." He turned around, smiling, but I was turning too. Hard and fast, kicking out at the door to the head we'd just passed. It had opened up just enough for a thick-wristed hand to thrust a 9mm Browning Parabellum at my back, just the way I'd expected it to. Behind the door, someone screamed as it slammed on his wrist. I threw my shoulder to the door before it could come open, and the Browning dropped to the floor. Then I jerked the door open. A young man who'd pushed weights with as much dedication as David came tumbling out. I slashed at the mass of black curls atop his head with the barrel of the Colt, hard enough to be certain that he'd hit the floor unconscious, but not hard enough to do any real damage. I whirled and yelled at Riggs, who'd reached the refrigerator and was about to open it. He froze with his fingers on the handle. "These damn glasses," he said. "They handled everything else well. Why couldn't they have put away their glasses? Or at least one of them?" "Probably too busy feeling good over being clever, Riggs. You tipped them off to trouble with the bringing a guest phrase. David camps up the bit about Jason being in town for the night, just enough to be convincing. Clever. I imagine you've had it all worked out ever since settling on the boat. All right, time to stop being clever. I want the file. No more tricks." I know, Floyd said, patting his hair. "I'm getting it for you." "No, you're playing fucking games. Jason had the big Browning. The little one was in your car. They make box sets of 3. Middle one's a 380. Used in Europe a lot. That's in the refrigerator, isn't it, Riggs?" He didn't answer, just got up and let me remove it. It felt like I'd spent the night taking away guns. While Riggs watched and Jason made soft moaning noises on the cabin floor, I dropped all 3 Brownings out the window. Then Floyd took me to the DARKSTAR file. It was in a styrofoam buoy floating on a line off the stern. Using a screwdriver, Riggs cracked the buoy along its seam, which had been opened once before and resealed. The interior was hollow. The file within, a blue manila folder thick with papers, was sealed in plastic. I opened it to check the contents and had Floyd signal David on shore. While the approaching outboard buzzed in my ear, I flipped through well-thumbed notes, Xeroxes, and occasional photostats. Something fell out onto the deck. I was about to reach down for it when the launch came alongside. Instead of David, Jesse Long was at the tiller. An automatic rifle was cradled in his free arm, aimed up at Riggs and me. "Just chuck the piece back over your shoulder, Indian. Far enough to get it into the water. Then you can toss that file down here in the boat." The Colt Terrier made a big, hollow splash. I began missing it right away. A lot more at the moment than I missed the DARKSTAR file when it landed at Jesse's feet. There was nothing left for Riggs and me to do but stare into the barrel of Jesse's weapon, an Armalite AR-10, and wonder how soon he'd start using it. Floyd began saying, oh, Jesus," over and over to himself. For a while I listened to him and other night sounds. Then I decided to see if Jesse felt like talking. "I thought hit and run was the League's official assassination method, Jesse." He smiled, but the AR didn't waver. "Whatever suits the occasion, man. I did one dude that way, Union Man. But if you're fishing to find who nailed the detective lady's daddy, forget it. Far as I know, that was a real hit and run. DARKSTAR people weren't happy about Cord's file, but he'd gotten his fingers in shit a few times when he was a cop, and they knew about it. So it was sort of live and let live. They could even deal from time to time. But when the blackmailing little flit beside you there grabbed hold of the file, everyone got nervous. Paxton claimed he could keep him satisfied, but the main men over in Oklahoma City kind of figured different. Them two factions are always a little at odds anyway." "Listen, the Oklahoma City people are wrong." Riggs moved excitedly to the rail, one hand going at the hairpiece. "I've got everything I was ever going to ask for. Keeping the file was just insurance. Tonight, my man Stalker canceled it, baby. League couldn't go after the file, so Dunsford came up with the idea of leaning on Stalker here, pushing him enough that he'd go right after it once the little cord fox put the bug in his ear. My right hand began doing its reflexive trip, opening, closing. Jesse seemed intent on his wrap, the position of the Armalite more relaxed in his grip, cradled almost carelessly. So you watched the refinery until I made my move, and then just followed us out here. Shit, Indian, I sure wasn't going to be over in Dawson watching that beat-up station wagon of yours. And that's when Jason came leaping off the cruiser's bridge, just like something from a movie. Beautiful, rippling white muscles tensed, body arcing through the air toward Jesse and the launch. He was dead before he hit the water. Ugly. Jesse looked up at me over the smoking AR. Guess we were both stalling for the same thing, only for different reasons, huh, Stalker? If he'd broke for shore, you probably could have jumped me when I turned for the shot. I was sweating it some when I heard that forward hatch, same as you. But those muscle-bound boys, seems they always gotta prove something, right? Kinda thought if I played it a little careless, I could get him to grandstand. His playmate on shore showed a bit of fight, too. You animal, Riggs shouted. You fucking animal. Jesse ignored him and kept staring at me. Damn it, Indian. You should have backed off when I gave you the chance there at the railroad tracks. Then he started shooting. Full automatic fire. The Armalite 10 is a lightweight weapon made mostly of aluminum with a few steel parts, making it handy to carry. But the lightness also induces muzzle climb on automatic fire. It rides up and to the left, so I tried to twist and drop in the opposite direction. Bullets stitched up through the back of my flak vest, almost parallel to my body, raking one shoulder with fire. The force sent me crashing back against the cabin and down to the deck. Floyd Riggs fell on top of me, his hairpiece gone and too much blood in its place. I was trying to move him when the grenade dropped lazily over the rail and bounced across the hardwood. I think I screamed, but my hand closed on it and flung it awkwardly. It cleared the bulkhead and exploded somewhere in the air. Riggs' body and the flak vest saved me from what shrapnel sprayed the boat. When my ears finally stopped ringing, I realized I couldn't hear what automatically should have followed the blast, the sound of the outboard revving up. I crawled to the opposite side of the deck from where I would have been seen falling, then peered quickly over the side. The launch was still afloat, but beginning to take on water. Bits of flame danced on it in places, but they were quickly going out. The grenade must have blown almost directly overhead, sending some fragments toward the cruiser, but most into the water and the launch, and Jesse Long. I caught hold of a line floating in the water and pulled the launch close enough to climb in. Jesse was breathing, but not too well. He opened his eyes a little. You could use a med evac, I said. Wouldn't help, even if they had him here. His voice was little more than a whisper I could almost imagine coming to me through a layer of bandages, just the way it had at the hospital in Japan, only caused this time by approaching death instead of the need for disguise. It should have been a shock. Bethany had picked up on the possibility when she went back over all the notes. Jesse had said at the tracks that he hadn't had time to look me up after the fragging, yet he knew I was at Zama. Even though the Army has 2 other hospitals in Japan to which I might just as easily been sent, Jesse said Zama. It was just a possibility. Sometimes they aren't easy to accept. Something must have shown on my face. Jesse read it and nodded. Yeah, the fragging, too. I had to lean very close to hear him now. I wanted out, remember? Just like I told you there at the tracks. Wanted out bad. Day old Dunsford showed up at base camp. I figured there's a dude with connections. able to do things for a man, or against him. He didn't get no help from you. Maybe he could use a little from me. So you went in with them then, not Oklahoma City like you said. And when the fragging didn't do it, they set it up for you to go play games with me there in Zama. Christ, Jesse. Once you're in for the whole ride. But I tried, Stalker. There on the railroad tracks. Tried to make up for some of it by warning you away. I tried, but I'm a hard nose. Sure, Jesse, I know. By the time I said it, he couldn't hear me anymore. I picked up the DARKSTAR file and started to nurse the launch to shore while it would still float. Then I remembered that something had fallen out just as Jesse appeared. It was still on the cruiser's deck. A photo, one that hadn't gone back to the wife of the dentist in Southern Hills. The figures in the foreground weren't important. One in the background was. Enough to be circled in white when the print was made. Enough to make me pretty certain who killed Bethany's father. In the proper moonlight, Adam's stalker can be quite a shock. I did my best to make this a dramatic performance. Having just about run out of night getting to Jared Paxton's home, I didn't want to waste what little time was left to me. Kenneth Hadley Chalmers woke up quickly. He had trouble breathing the way my hand was clamped on his mouth. When I could tell he wasn't going to scream, I removed it. Instead of listening, the Campbell's kid decided to fight. I pinned him quickly to the mattress and stared into his eyes. The pleading look of surprise on his face assured me that he was more than willing to take me to Jared Paxton. Paxton was slipping his square, stocky body into a robe as he opened his bedroom door and answered a Chalmers' urgent whispers and knock. Then he saw me. "What the hell is this about, Ken?" The congressman looked uncertainly from me to his future father-in-law and back again. He wore only pajama bottoms. "Well, he says he's Adam Stalker, Jared, the one who made all that trouble over in Vietnam." Paxton said it the way Lyndon Johnson used to. Vietnam. He scowled and pulled at his large, blunt nose. "Well, Ken and I have a wedding to attend tomorrow. You must have some reason to think you can get away with this without being shot or dragged off by the police, so I'll save time and give you that much. Now, the sooner you get to the point of this visit, the sooner the two of us can get back to bed." "I think you're done sleeping, Paxton, and I doubt there'll be a wedding. Tonight I got the DARKSTAR file from Floyd Riggs. Do you want to stand here in the hall and talk about it? Or is there a more private place we can go to watch you and Kenny squirm?" Paxton stared. There probably weren't many times when things happened for which he wasn't prepared. "My study's right behind us. We can talk there." Inside, Paxton and Chalmers headed for the brandy decanter. The Campbell's kid poured and drank, but Jared Paxton decided to ask a question first. I cut him off. "How do you know I'm not lying?" I took the photo from the pocket of my flak vest. "Congressman, get this for the father of the bride." Paxton started forward too, but I made sure Chalmers was the one who got it. "God, Jared, that's..." "It's your daughter, isn't it, Paxton? And it's the same picture Riggs must have shown you when he asked for the car, the boat, and the lifetime job. Before that, Cord probably flashed it so you'd stop nosing around Riggs about the DARKSTAR file. It could leave you up shit creek with the League, couldn't it?" Chalmers waved the photo in front of Paxton incredulously. "Jared, I'm presidential material. Any wife of mine has to be, well, clean. You can't expect me to saddle myself with anyone capable of this. I mean, look, she's enjoying it, for Christ's sake. If it's happened once, you can't tell me she wouldn't do it again, and..." "Shut up, you stupid son of a bitch!" Paxton exploded, shoving Chalmers and ripping the photo from his hand. "Sit down and shut up. You're going to be president. just like I promised on that day we set up the engagement, with that fine old Eastern establishment background and DARKSTAR money and leverage you cannot miss. That's how I sold you to those bastards over in Oklahoma City, and I guaranteed they could push you all away, and there'd be no problem because you were marrying my daughter. I'd always be right there, a power behind the throne, and they bought it, didn't they, Kenny? Just like I promised, even after you fucked up in Vietnam. So don't you make noises about running out, boy. I've kept the lid on this so far, and I'll keep on doing it. Chalmers had sat on a black leather overstuffed chair. He perched on the edge of the seat. But the League doesn't have anything to worry about now, Jared. After what they did for me in Nam, how could I ever turn on them? It's just the marriage I'm questioning. Why jeopardize my chances with a less than perfect wife? I mean, the congressman's a little slow, isn't he, Paxton? He doesn't understand that way it'd be just the Oklahoma City crew in charge, not you. But if he's slow, you're too damn fast. You didn't solve very much by rushing to run Cord down with that big black Continental out in your garage, the one with the newer headlight on the right-hand side. Chalmers got to his feet and started toward Paxton, who had set his untouched brandy down and was shredding the photo, letting the little pieces fall into an ashtray. Jared, well, he's talking about murder. If you're in some manner of power play against the rest of the League, that's your business, but I won't be dragged into a killing. You're still 24 people up on me, Ken, or don't you count Gooks? Sit down and be quiet. Paxton was pouring his brandy over the shreds in the ashtray. Cord had too many dealings with the Oklahoma City people, Stalker. After he showed me that picture, I couldn't be sure he wouldn't pass it along to them like he had with other information. They've hoarded the power long enough. I mean to shift it back to me by being the one with direct control over the DARKSTAR candidate. Once those bastards saw that photo, they'd have the excuse to shut me out. So I removed Cord to have someone I knew I could deal with, Floyd Riggs. Taking a match from a nearby holder, Paxton set fire to the content of the ashtray. It's a big file, Paxton. Do you think Cord had only one copy of that photo in it? And thanks to your associates in Oklahoma City, you don't have Riggs to deal with anymore. You've got me, and I'm partners with Bethany Cord. Paxton looked at me and did something that must have been very difficult. He smiled. Floyd was a partner of Cord's, Stalker. Open the drawer of the writing desk. I did. It reminded me a lot of the drawer in Riggs' office at the refinery. There was a checkbook and a gun inside. This gun was a .25 caliber Beretta Jetfire. Take out the checkbook, Stalker. There's a pen by the desk lamp. You write out your own price, son. Whatever you want, just write it out. I stood there. I stared at Kenneth Hadley Chalmers, who could live with being responsible for a massacre, but not with a wife who had sex in groups. And I stared at Jared Paxton, who wanted to control the DARKSTAR League and a president of the United States. Both stared back, eager, expectant, waiting for me to name my price. Forget it, Paxton. I've already got what I came for. I dropped the checkbook back in the drawer and didn't bother to close it. Then I started out of the study. Chalmers was on his feet talking before I was through the door. What else is in that file, Jared? You kept after Riggs for it in hopes of getting something on the others, didn't you? If it implicates the rest of the League in anything as serious as you've gotten yourself into, well, I mean, look, we're talking about total ruin. If I can't depend on you or them for help, well, then I'll have to find some way to get myself out. I mean, I left by the same second-floor window I came in. The gray morning half-light was already spread over the large, rolling backyard of Jared Paxton's home. I crept across it quickly, using trellises and shrubbery hung with decorations for the coming wedding reception as cover. All the way, I thought I could hear the two men in the study shouting. Then I stopped when I reached the protection of a thick stand of cottonwoods which bordered the property. If there had been sounds, the house was silent now. I looked down. Instead of opening, closing in reflex action, the fingers on my right hand were still and ready. The World gave it big headlines. Wedding, mourning, tragedy. Wealthy oil man shoots intended son-in-law, kills self. Bethany and I read it together over coffee in her office. One thing particularly pleased me. In the accompanying photos, Paxton's daughter seemed to be taking it well. Maybe now she'd have some choice about who she married, and her past sex life would be her own business again. You think Chalmers was ready to go to the authorities to make it easier on himself? Bethany was bringing her notes up to date. That's the way it was headed when I left. Having gotten into this because of what he staked on Chalmers, I don't think Paxton was about to let him just walk away. And killing himself only beat the League to it. He had to figure they'd blame him when all the DARKSTAR file info came out. Only it's never going to come out. Bethany poked at the DARKSTAR file where it lay on her desk. A pile of charred scraps, flaked ashes. All that I'd been able to gather up from the bottom of the launch after the grenade exploded. All that was left. Maybe there's a little Jared Paxton in me, I said. But I couldn't see him and the Campbell's kid getting off clean because of that. Not when 5 other people died over the damn file, your father included. And if the way things worked out, Bethany was left with 1 or 2 illusions about her father and the way he used the file. That didn't seem so bad either. Probably she didn't need them. She was cool and intelligent enough to handle whatever she had to handle. But I kept thinking about Jesse Long. Once, that meant laughing and drinking scotch. Now I couldn't think of him without also hearing the whisper at Zama Hospital or the grenade going off in my tent in Nam. I liked the first memory by itself, and I wouldn't have minded an illusion or 2 about Jesse to still have it that way. Maybe it'd be the same for Bethany. Hugh Dunsford and the rest of the DARKSTAR League were still out there, still in business. I didn't see them letting what had happened pass. We were just getting started with each other. Anything Bethany and I had to help us along, we could probably use. Even an illusion or 2.